Talking Iran and foreign policy, the JCPOA was a word hard to miss out. It got everyone riled up, both in 2015 when it was signed and in 2018 when the US pulled out. But then in March 2021, Iran signed a 25-year strategic treaty with China. And now it has acceded as full member to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Its request for an upgrade from observer member was accepted in September, after a wait of some 15 years. That's hardly coincidence. Iran has foreseen the importance of balancing its foreign policy concessions and gains by extending diplomatic and trade ties eastward. You can never know the result of an exam for sure, but you do your best to prepare. And Iranian politicians of the new government seem pretty satisfied with their change of foreign policy direction, leaning more eastwards. Time will tell, but pundits' predictions are also pretty reliable. So to hear those, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. The country's overall foreign policy strategy will remain the same. That is because foreign policy objectives are generally decided at the Supreme National Security Council, SNSC, where just half of its 10 members are represented by the president and his cabinet members. And the present government is not abandoning what has been set in motion before. It's just adopting a policy of pivot to the east rather than the west by watering seeds sown and casting a firm net wider. Let's see what our guest thinks of this new tendency and how different he finds it from the former government's foreign policy direction. Mr. Shojaian is an analyst and journalist at Jam Jam Daily, which means he's in the thick of current affairs. He received us at the newspaper headquarters where he shared his thoughts.
Well, obviously, the former government and those that came before it, more attention was paid to foreign policy, especially trans-regional issues. But as Mr. Raeisi's government takes office, it appears that they don't want to employ the same formula, as it didn't bring any noticeable result for the country. Therefore, by appointing Mr. Amir Abdullahian as Iran's foreign minister, who the parliament rightfully voted for, Mr. Raeisi is pursuing bilateral and multilateral relations with different countries.
Now, what's called for prioritizing regional and Asian ties over ultra-regional ties looking west? For one, the West hasn't been a reliable partner, at least where the United States has come into the equation, primarily since 2018. And it does come into the equation. Second, it's not a good idea to put all your eggs in one basket. An accusation principalists now in power have been bombarding the former moderate government with. I give you Mr. Barati, international group leader of Iran's think tank associations network. Why is it more important to expand regional ties rather than ultra-regional ties, if you agree it is?
Economic diplomacy, in my view, is very important. As it has been discussed in both governments, the same is true for Mr. Raeisi's government. But more important is whether this approach is based on real opportunities or only a perceived sense of opportunity, which takes time to translate into reality. In Mr. Raeisi's government, what Mr. Amir Abdullahian is mentioning is closer to reality. For one thing, the focus is directed at neighboring countries. They are Iran's markets. Even under the most severe economic sanctions, we maintained our economic transactions with countries like Iraq and Afghanistan.
This is not to say the West will be excluded from the equation. That would depend on how the Vienna talks go, however. Russia, one of the two major players in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the other being China, is replacing Germany as Iran's European trade partner for technical equipment. For pundit opinion, I've come to Parliament, one of the three powers in the country to which new foreign policy decisions have to be announced for approval. And I'll be talking to the National Security Committee spokesman. What economic potentials do our neighbors have which have been forgotten so far?
Iran has 15 neighbors. This means that we have independent trade opportunities with at least 15 countries. If we take into account the second layer of Iran's neighbors, the opportunities would be much more than this. There's a 500 million strong market around Iran. This creates a great opportunity for Iranian products. Statistically speaking, the region is earning $1.2 trillion in foreign trade, but Iran's share in the figure is about some 2%. In our opinion, that could be greatly improved.
The UAE has been challenging Iran, so to speak, and competing to become an international transit hub. Now, this is while Iran is both on the east-west and north-south transit corridors. Actually, while Iran meets the high seas in the south, say directly with its Chabahar port, just at the Caspian Sea in the north, it borders 5 countries. Iran is trying to break the sanctions by changing its foreign policy leanings. Do you think it's going to work, or do you see us in the end coming to terms with Western powers?
Iran is located at the center of China's BRI. Also, the north to south corridor passes through Iran to reach India's western ports and connect them to North Asia. Furthermore, Iran has a unique position as it connects to Europe through Turkey, Azerbaijan and Armenia. At the same time, Iran is cooperating with resistance countries like Iraq, Syria and Lebanon, which is creating a new route connecting Iran to the Mediterranean Sea. These all attest to Iran's unique geographical position.
The Caspian Sea, which is the world's largest lake, but still a lake, has an area of 380,000 square kilometers and 6,500 kilometers of coastline. And as it expands on the borders of several countries, it includes several major transportation corridors, such as the North-South Corridor, the Caspian-Black Sea Corridor, and Trans-Caspian Corridor, while playing a pivotal role in other new routes and emerging corridors. Abdullah Jafari, Director of International Agreements in the Ports and Maritime Organization, PMO, of Iran, pointed to the existence of more than 20 international ports and terminals in the Caspian littoral states. He specified Caspian littoral ports with a total operating capacity of about 140 million tons and having 300 active vessels, including the Russian fleet with 150 vessels, the Iranian fleet with 60 vessels, and 3 other countries with a total of 90 vessels, have a high capacity to develop maritime trade relations in the region. Iran is focusing on economic multilateralism, and its trade strategy has been shaped by 3 drivers: the desire to reduce dependency on Western sources of technology as well as promote trade among Islamic nations, technocratic priorities, say securing modern technologies and investments for key industries such as petroleum, telecom, automotive, and the desire to reduce the country's vulnerability to external sanctions by a resistance economy. The former administration said plenty on a resistance economy, and the present government insists on taking that forward.
The principle that the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran is pursuing is that negotiation and diplomacy should be focused on reaching a specific result, which in my opinion will not happen without addressing past mistakes. The JCPOA is an agreement that has been violated by the US once by simply walking out of it. If no effort is made to address this shortcoming, if the US government and other signatories to the deal don't propose a mechanism to solve this problem and won't offer any guarantees about it, a possible new deal wouldn't be that effective at all.
What do you think of Iran's new foreign policy, or leaning rather?
The newly formed 13th government has introduced its foreign policy goals. Amongst other things, it announced that it will focus on Iran's neighbors and would emphasize strengthening the country's economic diplomacy. Also, on the new government's foreign policy agenda is taking a new look at Asian powers and at the same time pursuing balanced diplomacy based on which Iran would establish balanced relationships with Asian, European, African and American countries.
for a short break. We'll be back in no time. A sign business is important to this administration is that President Raeisi made his first campaign event a meeting with the chiefs of the Chamber of Commerce. Now, having a resistance economy is to promote domestic capacity building, including expanding Iran's export potential. It absolutely does not mean isolating the country from the global economy. In fact, from the JCPOA signing to upgrading to permanent member with the Shanghai organization, Iran's efforts have been to join up with at least one economic bloc. Talking of blocs, the geopolitical look of the world is in transition. We'll shortly be hearing more on blocs and where Iran finds itself and where other countries find themselves in relation to Iran. Also, we'll talk of what's led to the present trade strategy. There's plenty more to be said and yet more to come up. But what there's room for today, I shall leave for after a quick media review, so do stay tuned to see what other outlets have to say.
All right. Let's check out some other news outlets' take on Raeisi's administration and foreign policies. Tehran Times headline reads, Raeisi not seeking to limit foreign policy dynamism, MP says. The article continues, the spokesman for the President's Board of the Iranian Parliament says, contrary to the claim of some people, the Raeisi administration does not seek to limit foreign policy dynamism, and the nuclear negotiations with the hope of revitalizing the 2015 nuclear deal will be pursued based on national dignity. In his remarks during the election campaign, President Ebrahim Raeisi explicitly stated that the way he and his administration will solve the country's problems is different from the previous administration. The MP stated that since Raeisi and many of his supporters are seriously critical of Rouhani's approach to running the country, which has led to many current problems, a new approach should naturally be taken in various areas in regards to negotiations. And here's the headline for Mehr News. It reads, Iran's foreign policy economy not to be tied to JCPOA. The article continues, the FM spoke about the negotiations on reviving the JCPOA, saying negotiations should be beneficial for the Iranian nation. In the meetings I said that we would not run away from the negotiations and we would accept it, but we need a reasonable amount of time to prepare. We will not tie the country's foreign policy and economy to negotiations and the JCPOA. The government has an economic development plan. If the negotiation is successful, it will be a catalyst for an economic development plan. But if the negotiations do not reach the desired results and the other parties do not want to show their true intention and will, as they claim, we will not wait for negotiations. Now here's the headline for foreign policy. It reads, an overview of Amir Abdullahian's intensive talks in New York. The article continues, new Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian and his diplomatic team spent 5 intensive working days in New York to elaborate on Iran's new foreign policy approaches. Amir Abdullahian held about 50 meetings with counterparts and officials from international institutions on the sidelines of the annual UN General Assembly meeting. His meetings were so intense and frequent that he himself told IRNA before leaving New York that indeed, if it were possible for me to stay in New York for another 2 or 3 days, some of the meetings will still be scheduled. I would not be able to make these appointments due to time constraints. And we followed up on some of them over the phone and on the sidelines of the meeting. Many countries wanted to hear about the policy of the new Iranian administration from its chief diplomat in order to regulate their relations on that basis and then decide. All right, I'm going to give the floor back to Leila to hear about the rest of our narrative on the story.
A combination of various factors has generated a trade strategy, which was formulated in 2019. The plan accounts for targeted import substitution and an expansion of trade with immediate neighbors, including Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, EEU. The objective was to double the value of exports sent to 15 immediate neighbors by March 2022, while reducing reliance on Western sources of technology by diversifying import sources.
The approach of balanced diplomacy, which is being followed in the 13th government and is also accepted in the parliament, is not a denial of the West. It simply means that every country or geographical region is given opportunities by Iran according to how much they are willing to cooperate with Tehran. Right now, the opportunity for cooperation between Iran and Asian countries is greater than ever.
To generate its needed foreign direct investment, Iran later expressed a desire to enter into long-term strategic partnership agreements with China and Russia. Be it a change of direction in foreign policy or implementing plans that were already in place, the Raeisi government is not in for an easy ride, but the horizon provides happy motivation.
China
has made great strides in the field of commercialized technologies, changing from a copycat in the field of technology to an innovator and owner of the technology. Take 5G telecom tech, for example, an advanced technology that was the basis of China's dispute with the US. This has made working with China an immense asset. Those who work with China say the country is an ocean of equipment and technology, and there's nothing you're after that you won't find in there. Russia is also advanced in military matters, including aerospace technology.
Unfortunately, in recent years, the US government and the White House have made every effort to disrupt Iran's diplomatic relations in various ways. We believe that this has happened at times if we have a realistic view of this issue. But our friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the cabinet and the government are not sitting idle, and good things will definitely happen. This includes strengthening the axis of resistance, which today has become an integral part of the region.
Talking of economic multilateralism and broader relations with the world, particularly neighboring countries, this was jump-started importantly by Iran's ascension to the SCO. Addressing the 21st SCO summit in Dushanbe, the Tajik capital, Ayatollah Raeisi, who assumed office on the 3rd of August 2021, said, "The combination of the Eurasia and One Road, One Belt initiatives can be an objective realization of this approach and the vast potential of the Islamic Republic of Iran in terms of geopolitics, population, energy, transportation, human resources. And most importantly, spirituality, culture and civilization can cause a significant stimulus to this outlook." As for who will find itself where in relation to Iran, the West doesn't appear happy about its slot, its slimming slot. Having failed to hold up their end of the bargain with the JCPOA or nuclear deal in lifting sanctions off Iran and giving its economy a boost, the West has had to sit back and watch as Iran pivots eastwardly. And the Iran-China 25-year cooperation program, Western powers have been trying to portray as a win-loss accord, with Iran at the losing end. They do realize that agreement will diffuse the impact of US embargoes and the need for Iran to hold on to Europe for that. In fact, the New York Times reported that the Iran-China deal, covering a quarter of a century, is a big blow to the hostile maximum pressure of the Trump administration against Iran, and that it can become a new center of tensions between the US and China.
The developments that have been taking place in recent years have been in the field of economics. That is, we are seeing sweeping changes in the international economy. We are witnessing China's increasing power and access to advanced technologies. This shift in economic power from the west to the east of the world brings changes that can create opportunities for us, although we must pursue them with our eyes wide open. I believe that the most detrimental move you can make is to have implicit trust and focus on the outside. But in the current state of affairs, I believe China will become a new power in the new world order.
China has also been challenging US foreign policy by buying crude oil from Iran and Venezuela, two countries boycotted by the US. But the West only has itself to blame, as China and Russia were the first JCPOA parties to recognize the lifting of the arms embargo on Iran based on UNSC Resolution 2231, which endorsed the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This pact was between Iran and the 5 permanent UN Security Council members plus 1. That's the US, UK, France, Russia, China and Germany.
Of course, this hasn't been a path that would lead to our terminating cooperations with Europe, but the Westerners have made commitments in the JCPOA to pave the way for Iran to enjoy the economic benefits of the deal. But the illegal US withdrawal from the accord and Europe's inaction and negligence didn't allow Iran's trade ties with the West to improve. They've missed this opportunity.
The US also has a new President Biden who came in giving the world fresh hope. He could have issued executive orders to lift at least some of the sanctions against Iran the day he took office on 20th January. At least that was Iran's expectation, but he didn't. The US and West at large seem to be under the illusion further pressure will get Iran to concede and appeal to Western powers for relief. But Iran will not stop at anything short of a guarantee from the US and West any longer. Fool me once, fool me twice.
In general, international imperialism will never remove the sanctions, at least not altogether, because it opposes the philosophy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because they haven't fulfilled their interests and greed in the region and can't see them as long as the Islamic Republic of Iran is in power. This has been made clear. They won't lift the sanctions. There were some positive developments during the golden days of the Obama administration, but as we saw, they reneged on their promises. As the former head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran said, they went back on their word. That's why they can't be trusted.
Referring to US maximum pressure sanctions Iran is still under, Kazem Gharibabadi made a biblical reference. One should not expect that if he slaps someone on the right cheek, that someone would turn the other cheek. The extraterritorial dimensions of US sanctions, which are in contradiction with international law, prevented even the US's European friends from implementing their commitments. This is while all 15 quarterly reports of the Nuclear Watchdog Director General up to May 2018 and a year after that stated clearly that Iran was in full compliance with the JCPOA. It took a whole year of persistent non-compliance by the US that Iran decided to use its rights under the JCPOA to adopt a policy of partially ceasing implementing its commitments under that deal. Even then, the IAEA or UN nuclear watchdog was able to monitor and verify steps Iran was taking in that regard. In the same vein, it was only after about 2.5 years of continued proliferation of US economic sanctions that on the 2nd of December 2020, Iranian parliament passed a law. The law required the government to stop the implementation of all verification and monitoring activities beyond Iran's safeguards agreement concluded with the IAEA, CSA and so forth.
After the cowardly assassination of Mr. Fakhrizadeh last year, the parliament passed a law that obliged the government to stop all inspections beyond the safeguards agreement by March 2021. That was a gesture from the Islamic Republic of Iran in the framework of the nuclear deal. But when the Western signatories don't honor their obligations, logic dictates that the other side would also reduce its commitments. But to give diplomacy a chance, considering that the Biden administration had just taken office and had expressed willingness to return to the deal, something we have realized isn't very true, Iran and the IAEA reached a deal.
China is now Iran's first trading partner, and other countries in the Eurasian region have become Iran's new partners who are receiving new attention in our foreign trade. But as long as the other side is not ready to improve the economic and trade situation with Iran, they should not expect Iran to wait for them. There are more than 200 countries in the world, each of which is seen as an opportunity to enhance cooperation. These opportunities in Asia, Iran-China cooperations, and those in the ASEAN and our neighbors used to be potential in the past but have now been actualized.
All efforts and concessions, however, haven't stirred much Western action. Hence, Iran's veering away from the West to include more of the East for the long haul and easing tensions with other regional players, such as Saudi Arabia. That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's on. And remember, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook via at Iran Today Show. Bye for now.